Adam thrived in the darkness. 14 years he had spent working the graveyard shift in museums, surrounded by echoes of the past. He knew the rhythm of the night, the way shadows danced in the moonlight. Each night was a journey through history, a solitary exploration of forgotten stories. But nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for this. The museum was a labyrinth of shadowy corridors and towering exhibits. Adam patrolled the halls, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. He paused at the entrance to the Egyptian exhibit, a shiver crawling down his spine. The hieroglyphs lining the sarcophagi seemed to writhe and shift, their ancient power palpable. He moved on, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the feeling of unease persisted, clinging to him like cobwebs. The silence, once a comfort, now felt oppressive. It was as if the very walls were listening, waiting for him to let down his guard. Something about this museum chipped away at his certainty, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. Two weeks of unsettling quiet, fleeting shadows, and a growing sense of dread. He'd been hired for his experience, but nothing had prepared him for this. It started subtly, a flicker at the edge of his vision, a whisper that vanished quickly. As the days turned into nights, the incidents became more frequent. The shadows grew bolder, lingering in doorways, darting behind pillars. The whispers morphed into distinct sounds, a soft sigh, a muffled laugh, footsteps echoing through empty corridors. He started to feel a presence unseen but palpable following him. Adam had always dismissed supernatural tales as folklore. Now he wasn't so sure. It began simply, a flicker at the edge of his vision. Easy to dismiss as fatigue, but Adam knew the difference. There was a rhythm to the night, a predictable dance of light and shadow. This was something else. He found himself pausing more often, his gaze sweeping across the darkened exhibits. The feeling lingered, a prickle on the back of his neck, the unsettling sensation of being watched. The silence seemed to amplify every creak and groan of the old building. He chided himself for acting like a rookie. This was just a job, a paycheck. The flicker persisted, growing bolder each night. It began to intrude, a fleeting darkness darting across the walls. At first Adam tried to ignore it, telling himself it was a moth, a bat, but deep down a primal fear took root. One night he swore he saw it again, a shadow slipping behind a statue. He froze, his heart pounding, but found nothing. He forced a laugh, a nervous expulsion of air that did little to ease the tension. By the fifth night the flicker had morphed into a full-fledged shadow. Adam, his nerves frayed, decided to confront it. Near the medieval armory he saw it, a tall, indistinct shape lurking in the shadows. "All right, that's enough," he muttered, stepping closer. "I don't know what you are, but this game is over." The shadow didn't move, remaining perfectly still. Adam, his heart hammering, took another step, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but dust motes. Adam felt a chill run down his spine. He was alone. Or was he? The feeling of being watched intensified, prickling at the hairs on the back of his neck. He spun around, flashlight beam sweeping across the armory. Empty suits of armor stared back at him. He could have sworn he felt a breath on his neck, cold and fetid. His pulse quickened. He needed to get a grip. Adam found himself drawn to the Egyptian exhibit. It was the oldest, most unsettling part of the museum. He hated the way the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. And most of all, he hated the obsidian amulet. Carved from a single piece of obsidian, it depicted a scarab beetle. But it was the energy emanating from the amulet that unsettled Adam. It was as if the amulet held a consciousness, a malevolent intelligence that watched and waited. Tonight, Adam had come prepared with his trusty flask of whiskey. He knew it was foolish, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. He took a long swig, feeling his anxiety lessen. "All right, you ancient relic," he muttered, staring down at the obsidian amulet. He spent hours pacing around the Egyptian exhibit, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The silence was unnerving, broken only by his own breathing. He was starting to think he was wasting his time, When he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible above his heartbeat. He froze, his flashlight beam wavering. He strained his ears, listening for any repetition of the sound. Silence. He was about to dismiss it when he heard it again, a whisper, soft and sibilant. It was a language he didn't recognize, sending chills down his spine. He shone his flashlight around the exhibit, but there was nothing there. And then, the lights flickered, and the museum was plunged into darkness. "Shit," Adam cursed, fumbling for his flashlight. The whispering grew louder, swirling around him. He had to get out of there. Panic swelled in Adam's chest. The whispers intensified, morphing into a low, guttural chant. He couldn't understand the words, but he could feel their malevolent intent. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. His breath caught in his throat, every instinct screaming at him to run. He remembered the layout of the museum, the emergency exits, but fear drove him deeper into the darkness. He stumbled over something hard and metallic. He shone his flashlight down, realizing he was beside the empty pedestal where the amulet had been displayed. The case was empty. The obsidian amulet was gone. It wasn't just an object, it was something alive, something malevolent. He needed to get out, to call for help. But the whispers, now a cacophony of sound, seemed to press in on him, urging him forward, deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the museum. He was no longer in control of his own actions, his body moving on instinct, driven by a fear so profound it bordered on madness. He stumbled through the darkness, his flashlight beam a beacon of futility in the overwhelming blackness. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the scent of dust and decay, a suffocating miasma that seemed to cling to his lungs, stealing his breath. He could feel the whispers closing in around him, pressing against his skin like icy fingers, their voices growing louder, more insistent. The chanting had become a chorus, a symphony of shadows and whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He was trapped, hunted by something he couldn't see, couldn't understand. His flashlight beam darted frantically across the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty hallways and the occasional glint of glass from a display case. He was lost, disoriented, his senses overloaded by the oppressive darkness, the suffocating air, the relentless chanting that seemed to be closing in on him like a tightening noose. And then, through the darkness and the fear, he saw it. A faint light flickering like a candle flame at the end of the corridor. Hope surged through him, a lifeline in the sea of darkness. He stumbled towards it, his pace quickening, his fear momentarily forgotten in the desperate need to escape. As he drew closer, the light grew stronger, revealing the outline of a doorway, an archway leading into another part of the museum. He didn't recognize this section, but it didn't matter. All he cared about was getting out of the darkness, away from the whispers that seemed to be clawing at his sanity. He was almost to the doorway, when the light flickered once and died, plunging him back into absolute darkness. A strangled cry escaped his lips as he stumbled to a halt, his hand flying out to brace himself against the wall. And that's when he saw it. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light filtering in from the hallway beyond, was a figure. Tall, skeletal, its form shrouded in what appeared to be tattered robes. 2 points of light burned within the depths of its hood, like embers in the darkness. Adam froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The chanting stopped. An unnerving silence descended, broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. He stared at the figure, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was as if time itself had ground to a halt, every detail of that moment etched into his memory with terrifying clarity. The figure's stillness, the way it seemed to absorb the surrounding light, the 2 burning embers that locked onto his gaze with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. He couldn't tell how long they stood there, locked in that silent confrontation. It felt like an eternity, a timeless void where fear was the only constant. Then, as slowly and deliberately as it had appeared, the figure began to move towards him. 1 step, 2. Each movement was agonizingly slow, measured, as if the figure was savoring Adam's terror, drawing it out, prolonging the moment. The air grew colder, the scent of decay stronger, until it felt like a physical presence, suffocating him, pressing down on him. Just as the figure was a step away, A hair's breadth from reaching him, the lights flickered back on. The sudden illumination was blinding. Adam blinked rapidly, his eyes struggling to adjust. He looked back to the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was gone. The sudden return of light was like a physical blow. Adam reeled, his eyes stinging, his breath caught in his throat. The hallway stretched before him, empty, illuminated by the harsh glare of the emergency lights. The chanting had ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy, pregnant with unseen menace. He didn't hesitate, didn't waste a single second trying to rationalize what he'd seen. His body, fueled by adrenaline and raw terror, took over. He turned and fled, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor, the sound bouncing off the walls like the frantic beat of a drum. He didn't look back, didn't dare to see if the figure was following him. His lungs burned, his legs screamed for respite, but still he ran. The museum, once a place of wonder and intrigue, had transformed into a nightmare, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers that he was desperate to escape. He careened around corners, his flashlight beam a jittery beacon in the darkness, his mind a chaotic jumble of fear and adrenaline. The emergency exit seemed miles away, each corridor stretching endlessly before him, twisting and turning in a disorienting dance of shadows and light. The night air hit him like a slap, cold, crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and something else, something ancient and unsettling that clung to the back of his throat like bile. He stumbled out of the museum, his chest heaving, his legs shaky beneath him. He didn't stop running until he reached the street, the harsh glare of the streetlights momentarily blinding him. The city, usually a symphony of noise and light, seemed strangely muted, as if holding its breath, observing him from a distance. He glanced back at the museum, its imposing facade looming over the street, its windows dark and lifeless. From this distance it seemed almost peaceful, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. But Adam knew better. He had looked into the heart of that silence, had felt the icy breath of something ancient and malevolent. He stood there for a long moment, catching his breath, trying to slow the frantic beating of his heart. The events of the night replayed in his mind, a terrifying montage of shadows, whispers, and that final, chilling encounter in the darkened doorway. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He needed to call someone, tell someone what had happened, but who would believe him? Who would understand? He was just a night watchman, a nobody paid to sit in the dark and pretend to guard against the impossible. He looked back at the museum, a shiver running down his spine. He could almost feel its gaze upon him, cold and calculating, as if daring him to return, to test its boundaries once more. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would never be free of this place, that it had sunk its claws into him, marked him as its own. He thought about the amulet, the obsidian scarab beetle with its outstretched wings. Was it merely an object, a conduit for some unseen force? Or was it something more, something alive, something malevolent that had chosen him, singled him out for its own twisted purposes? He didn't know the answers, and for the first time in his life he didn't want to know. Some things, he realized, were best left buried in the darkness, locked away in the silent tombs of history. Adam turned and walked away from the museum, his steps slow at first, hesitant then gradually gaining purpose. He didn't know where he was going, what he would do next, but one thing was certain: he would never set foot inside that building again. He had looked into the abyss, had felt the icy breath of something ancient and evil, and it had changed him. He was no longer the man he had been, the skeptic who dismissed the whispers of the night as mere superstition. He had seen the truth, had felt its touch, and it had left an indelible mark on his soul. As he walked, he could feel the city watching him, its lights seeming to flicker and dim as he passed. He was a stranger in a familiar land, marked by his encounter with the darkness, forever changed by the whispers that echoed in the silence of his mind. The museum stood silent, its secrets locked away once more. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty, expectant. It was a silence filled with the knowledge of what had transpired, of the terror that had unfolded within its walls. It was a silence that held its breath, waiting, watching, for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold and awaken the darkness within.